I'll be talking about the enterprise architecture vision, or in TOGAF ADM, as part of the TOGAF ADM development tool, which is designed to create enterprise architecture in different aspects of enterprise. In this session, I will talk about the first phase of TOGAF ADM, which is called preliminary and is related to gathering information about the idea of enterprise architecture from a particular a company or particular enterprise's view of point. The first phase is the phase called preliminary. This phase describes the preparation and intention activities required to meet the business directive for a new enterprise architecture. This phase includes the definition of organization-specific architecture framework and the definition of principles. So basically in this phase we are defining what the enterprise is, the major overall goals and objectives of the enterprise are set and is ready for the next phase, which will be the architecture vision. Objectives of this phase is to determine the architecture capability desired by the organization. So this is the capability that we are going to achieve in this enterprise architecture exercise. Review the organizational context for conducting enterprise architecture. That is what context the organization will be put in, basically what is the business of the organization, and it has to be reviewed and reset if requires. Identify the scope, the elements of the enterprise organization affected by the architecture capabilities. So these capabilities are the capabilities that we are going to introduce into the new enterprise. Identify this establishment of a framework, methods, processes that interests with the architecture capabilities. Establish capability maturity target. So we in previous sessions we talked about the capability maturity model, and this is where we actually setting the goal of where in terms of capability maturity model the organization will be after this exercise. Establish the architectural capability, including defining and establishing the organizational model for enterprise architecture, defining and establishing a detailed process and resources for the architecture governance, selecting and implementing tools that support the architecture capabilities. These tools are systems and also could be processes throughout the organization. And eventually is to define the architectural principles that we are going to adhere with. In terms of approach, the enterprise architecture provides a strategic top-down view of an organization to enable the executives, planners, architects, and engineers to coherently coordinate the integration and conduct their activities. The enterprise architecture framework provides the strategic context for this team to operate within it. Therefore, developing the enterprise architecture is not a solitary activity, and the enterprise architects need to recognize the interoperability between their frameworks and the rest of the business. And that's why the business IT alignment comes in this perspective. Strategic, interim, and tactical business objectives and aspirational needs to be met as well. Similarly, the enterprise architecture need to reflect these requirements and allow for operation of architectural discipline at the different levels within the organization. Depending on the scale of the enterprise and the level of budgetary commitment to the enterprise architecture discipline, a number of approaches may be adopted to subdivide or partition the architectural teams, processes, and deliverables. Approaches for architectural partitioning are discussions of Part V of Article 40 in architectural partitioning in TOGAF framework. The preliminary phase should be used to determine the desired approach to partitioning and the establishment of the groundwork for the selected approach to be put into practice. So basically, we go through these approach steps of the approach, and we'll see how where it gets us. One of the most important aspects of the preliminary phase is the enterprise scope. The scope of the enterprise and whether it is federated will determine those stakeholders who will derive most benefits from the enterprise architecture capability. It is imperative that the sponsor is appointed at this stage to ensure that the resultant activity has resources to proceed and clear support of the business management. So somebody has to own this process. The enterprise may encompass many organizations, and the duty of the sponsor are to ensure that all stakeholders are included in the defining, establishing, and using the architectural capabilities. Next stage after that is we arrive on something called enterprise vision. Here we describe the initial phase of the architectural development method, which is ADM. It includes information about defining the scope, identifying the stakeholders, creating the architectural vision, and obtaining approval from those stakeholders or the sponsors who we found in the preliminary phase. In terms of scope, before I go ahead, I mentioned a couple of other things. Scope decisions need to be made on the basis of a practical assessment of resources and competencies, competency availabilities, and the value that can realistically be expected to be created to the enterprise for the chosen scope of an architectural work. The issue involving in this are discussed in point 5.5, scoping of ADM. If you go to the documentation, it's pretty clear. In other words, scoping issues addressed in architectural vision phase will be restricted to specific objectives for this cycle and will be constrained within the overall scope definition for architectural activities as established within the preliminary phase and embodied within the architectural framework. The constraints will normally be informed by the business principles and architecture principles and developed as part of the preliminary phase. Normally, the business principles, business goals and strategies and strategic drivers of the organization are already defined elsewhere in the enterprise. If so, the activity in phase A is involved with ensuring with existing definitions that are current and clarifying any areas of ambiguity. Otherwise, it involves defining these essential items for the first time. Okay, so in terms of objectives, the objectives of the phase A is summarized in these 2 points. We're talking about developing a high-level inspirational vision of the capabilities, what we wanted to be able to do for the business, to create a value and to deliver value and results of the proposed architectural enterprise architecture. And the other thing is to obtain approval from for the architectural statement from the stakeholders, main stakeholders and the sponsors of the enterprise architecture or the new enterprise architecture. In terms of approach, at phase A, we start with the receipt of the request for the architectural work as in some sort of form of some sort of document from the sponsors organizations or sponsors within the organization, and also we define the scope of this vision. Basically, we're defining what is in and what is outside of the scope of this architectural effort and the constraints that must be dealt with through this scope. Clarifying and agreeing the purpose of the architectural effort is one of the key parts of this activity, creating vision. And the purpose needs to be clearly reflected in the vision that is created. Normally, key elements of the architectural vision, such as enterprise mission, vision, strategy, and goals, have been documented as part of some wider business strategy or enterprise planning activity that has its own life cycle within the enterprise somewhere else. Normally this is done. In such a case, the activity in phase A is concerned with verifying and understanding the documentation or the documented business strategy and goals, and possibly bridging between the enterprise strategy and goals on one hand and the strategy and goals implicit within the current architectural reality. So we wanted to see what is the current state and what is going to be, and therefore understanding the gap between as is and to be as a feature of speech. The key element of the architectural vision are basically 4 points that we already mentioned. I already mentioned enterprise mission, enterprise vision, strategy, and goals. The architectural vision provides a first cut, high-level description of the baseline and the target architecture, converting the business, data, application, technology, and so on, all these domains. These outline descriptions are developed in subsequent phases. So at this phase, we're not developing anything. We're just creating the vision of what is to be. Inputs of this phase are described as several things in different categories. The first category of inputs is the reference materials external to the enterprise. If you remember, we had a bucket, an enterprise bucket, that we had all these enterprise pre-developed material or reference materials. This category is talking about that kind of reference material. The architectural repository acts as a holding area for all architectural related projects within the enterprise, and these inputs are the ones that we are going to use in this phase. The second category of inputs to the phase A is non-architectural inputs, such as a request for architectural work or request for architectural request for work. Business principles, business goals, business drivers, for example, business principles, business goals, and what drives this business as documentations. In phase A, we will have inputs as architectural inputs as well as non-architectural inputs. We can put them in many different categories, and then every category we could have possibly, I've listed a few subcategories of those architectural inputs. For example, organizational model for enterprise architecture, including the scope of the organizational impacted. Where is an organization, which departments, what processes are impacted by the new enterprise architecture. Maturity assessment, gaps and resolution approaches, roles and responsibilities for architectural teams. So you need to know who does what. Constraints on architectural work. What are the things we cannot do, and then different constraints has to be taken into consideration. For example, technical constraints, financial constraints, or perhaps business operational constraints. Reuse requirements. Okay, how much of the current thing we can reuse? Budget requirements. How much does it cost, and will it be possible to obtain that level of financial support? Governance and support strategies. Okay, so when the organizational architecture is created, how is it going to be governed, and what are the support requirements for the governance of the new architecture? Second category is the tailored architectural framework. For example, the architecture methods, architecture contents, architectural principles, including business principles when, if existed, configuration or configuring the deployed tools. Okay. The third category is the populated architecture repository, existing architectural documentation, and so on. Okay, steps. Okay, so what are the steps that we are going to take in order to deliver the architectural vision? The level of details addressed in phase A will depend on the scope and the goals of the requests for architectural work, or the subset of scope and goals associated with this iteration of architectural development. The order of the steps in phase A, as well as the time at which they are formally started and completed, should be adapted to the situation at hand in accordance with the established architectural governance. So there is no particular order onto this. It's all dynamically determined. Number one is talking about the establishing the architectural project, so to do that, we conduct the necessary procedure to secure recognition of the project, the endorsement of corporate management, and the support and commitment of necessary line managements, including references to other management frameworks in use, if there is any, within the enterprise, explaining how these projects relate to each other in regards to other frameworks. Number two is talking about identifying stakeholders and their concerns. Identifying the key stakeholders and their concerns and objectives, and defining the key business requirements to be addressed in the architectural engagement is the main point of this activity or this step. Stakeholders engagement at this stage is intended to accomplish three important objectives. Okay, so in step 2 we have three important objectives. A, to identify candidate vision, components and requirements to be tested as the architectural vision is developed. B, to identify candidate scope boundaries for the engagement to limit the extent of architectural investigation required. And C, to identify stakeholder concerns, issues, and cultural factors that will shape how the architecture is presented and communicated. Okay? Now, step 3 is to identify the business goals and strategic drivers of the organization. If these have already been defined elsewhere, somewhere within the enterprise, we need to ensure that the existing definitions are current and clarify any area of ambiguity within them. Otherwise, go back to the organizations of this, originators of the statement of architectural work and work with them to define these essential items and secure their endorsement by corporate management. Number 4 is about evaluating business capabilities. This is to it is a valuable thing to understand a collection of capabilities within the enterprise. One part refers to the capability of the enterprise to develop and consume the architecture, and the second part refers to the baseline and target capability level of the enterprise. Gaps identified in the architectural capability requires iteration between architectural vision and the preliminary phase to ensure that the enterprise capability is suitable to address the scope of the enterprise project. Okay? This step seeks to understand the capability and desires of the enterprise at the appropriate level of abstraction. Another important thing that I probably need to mention about the step 4 is that the consideration of the gap between the baseline and the target capability of the enterprise is crucial. Showing the baseline and target capability within the context of the overall enterprise can be supported by creating value chain diagrams that show the linkage of related capabilities. The result of the assessment are documented in capability assessment document. Step 5 is talking about accessing assessing the readiness of the business transformation. So how ready this business is to be transformed. Basically, a business transformation readiness assessment can be used to evaluate and quantify the organization's readiness to undergo these changes. This assessment is based upon the determination and analysis of a series of readiness factors. The results of the readiness assessment should be added to the capability assessment document. These results are then used to shape the scope of the architecture to identify activities required within the architectural project and to identify the risk areas to be addressed. Step 6 is to define the scope. Is to define what is inside and what is outside the scope of the baseline architecture and target architecture efforts. It is to create an understanding that the baseline and target need not to be described at the same level of details. In many cases, baseline is described at the higher level of abstraction, so more time is available to specify the target in sufficient more details. The issue involved in this are discussed in 5.5 scoping of the architecture documented in ADM documentation. The important things about the scoping, there are a few points that I wanted to add, are particularly defined as the breadth of coverage of the enterprise, the level of details required, the partitioning characteristics of the architecture, the specific architectural domains to be covered, the context of the time period aimed at, plus the number of content of any immediate time period, the architectural assets to be leveraged or considered for use for the organizational enterprise continuum are the most important components of scoping, which is the point 6. Now at point 7, we are talking about review the principles under which the architecture is to be developed. Architectural principles are normally based on the principles developed as part of the preliminary phase. They are explained, and an example set given in part 3 of number 23 of ADM architectural principles documentation. It is to ensure that the existing definitions are current and clarify any areas of ambiguity, otherwise go back and fix the problem and develop the thing with the appropriate corporate management. Number 8 is about to developing architectural vision itself. Based on the stakeholder concerns, business capability requirements, and scope and constraints and principles create a high-level value of the baselines and target architecture. The architecture vision typically covers the breadth of scope identified for the project at the high level. Informal architecture or informal techniques are often employed to do that. A common practice is to draw simple solution concept diagrams that illustrate the concise major components of the solution and how the solution will result in benefit for the enterprise. This step generates the first high-level definitions of the baseline and target environment from a business, information systems, and technology perspectives. As we described in outputs, we'll be describing in outputs. These initial versions of an architecture should be stored in the architectural repository, and organization should organize them according to the standards and guidelines established in the architectural framework. Number 9 is to define the target architecture value proposition and KPI, capability or key performance indicators. We need to develop the business case for the architecture and change required product or produce a value proposition for each of the stakeholder groupings. And also we need to assess and define the procurement requirement for the enterprise vision. We also need to review and agree the value proposition with the sponsors and stakeholder concerned in this matter. Also define the performance matrix and measures to be built into the enterprise architecture to meet the business needs. And we also finally have to be able to assess the business risks in step 9. At step 10, we identify the business transformation risks and mitigation activities. To do that, we identify the risks associated with the architectural vision and assess the initial level of risk and the potential frequency associated with this risk. We assign a mitigation strategy for each risk. A risk management framework is already described in part 3, number 31 of risk management of this document, ADM document. There are 2 levels of risk that should be considered in step 10. First level is the initial level of risk, which is the risk categorization prior to determining and implementing mitigation actions. And the second is the residual level of risk, which is the risk categorization after implementation of mitigating actions, if any exist. Risk mitigation activities should be considered for inclusion within the statement of architectural work. At step 11, we are to develop the statement of architectural work and secure its approval. To do so, we assess the work product that are required to be produced against the set of business performance requirements. To do that, this requires, this involves ensuring the performance metrics are built into the work product. It also requires specific performance-related work products to be available. Then activities will involve identifying new work product that will need to be changed, provide a direction on which existing work product, including building blocks, will need to be changed, and ensure that all activities and dependencies on these are coordinated together. Identify the impact of change on other work products and dependencies on their activities is important. Based on the it is important. It's basically based on the purpose, focus, scope, and constraints. Determine which architecture domains should be developed, to what level of details, and what architecture views should be built. Assess the resource requirements and availability to perform the work. Estimate the resource needed to develop a roadmap and schedule for the proposed development. Define the performance metrics to be met during the cycle of the ADM by the enterprise architecture team. Develop the specific enterprise architectural communication plans and show where, how, and when the enterprise architect will communicate with the stakeholders, including affinity, groupings and communities, about the progress and progress of the enterprise architecture development. Review and agree the plan with the sponsors. And that's it. These are the main important parts of the steps to develop the statement of architectural work. And finally, the final thing that we need to discuss is the outputs of this phase A. We need to approve the statement of architectural work. So an approved statement of architectural work is a document needed for this phase. We need to refine statements of business principles. So a refined statement of business principles, business goals, and business drivers is another document. We need a architectural principles document. We need a capability assessment document. We need a tailored architectural framework. I've already discussed all these documentation in the steps that in previous slide. We need an architectural vision document. That includes problem description, objectives of the statement of architectural work, summary views, business scenarios, refined key high-level stakeholder requirements. I also failed to mention that in the first output, approved statement of architecture, we need to put things such as architectural project description and scope, an overview of architectural vision, architectural project plan and schedule. In step 5, also we need to you know, the output number 5, we need to make sure we put a tailored architectural method, a tailored architectural content, such as deliverables and artifacts. We need to make sure to put a configured and development or developed tools in place into that document. In step 6, I discussed the step 6 already. Architectural vision includes problem description, objectives and statement of architectural work, summary views, business scenarios in different options, of course, probably, refine key high-level stakeholder requirements. Step 7 or output 7 is where we define a draft architectural definition document that may include things such as baseline business architecture, baseline technology architecture, baseline data architecture, baseline application architecture, target business architecture, target technology architecture, and target data architecture, and target application architecture. So we need the baselines and target for all 4 elements, which is business, technology, data, and application. Output number 8, we need a communications plan. Output number 9 is about the additional content populating the architectural repository. Okay.